Yes.
Okay, welcome to another Word in Your Ear, brought to you by the good graces of Two Cocoa Tins and a Bit of String Productions. And we're delighted to be joined once more by old friend of the pod, Dylan Jones, who's going to talk about his new book, Sweet Dreams, the story of the new romantic side. I thumped it to make a point about how stout a volume it is. Welcome, Dylan. How you doing?
I'm great, thank you.
Brick like tone. Yeah.
And Mark is halfway through it, so it's brilliant.
No, I'm not halfway through it. I've read the whole thing.
Well,
that was marking a page. No.
Yeah, I've got page markers in mine as well. Yeah. So when talking about this before, it was in the last few weeks, I said that Mark and I were going to be honouring the occasion by picking out special memorial tea towels to wear in the evening, which suggests that we still have the same kind of tongue-in-cheek attitude to the new romantics that we had as we experienced it in firsthand on the smash hits days and so forth. But that's just the kind of disrespectful attitude you'd expect us to show. But clearly you believe it was more than just an interlude of fancy dress. Is that fair to say? Tell us what you set out to do here.
Well, I think it was twofold. I think there was a period where everyone used to say the 70s was the decade that taste forgot. And this went on for quite some time. And then it gradually sort of morphed into being the 80s that taste forgot. And about 15 to 18 years ago in this country, there was a spate of television programs which focused on the 80s, which picked up on the sort of the more trivial aspects of it, like rah-rah skirts and Cabbage Patch dolls and all sort of trivia. And it was, oh, the 80s, isn't that funny, ha, ha, ha. But actually, this is principally the reason that I wrote the book, is that for two reasons. A, I think that apart from the period in the 60s, between 64 and 68, I do think that this is the greatest period for British pop singles ever, 79 to 84. And also, I genuinely think that it's a period of great creativity, great bohemianism, a great platform for gay pop. And it wasn't just this sort of, if you look at a lot of the imagery of the time, it's sort of men pretending to be women, women pretending to be men. But far more importantly than that, I think it was a period where sexuality became far more sort of part of the conversation than it had been before. And I think it was a great period of liberation, creativity, and on entrepreneurialism. So I'm become very, very passionate about it.
So why did you decide to start specifically in 1975 and end in 1985?
Because
why were those the bookends?
Because in 75 you had the protagonist of the early punk period, who became the protagonist of the early new romantic period. That was the year that both David Bowie and Brian Ferry embraced soul music. And so you had the sort of rock fraternity over here, you had the soul fraternity over here, and they sort of married. And you had Roxy Music doing Siren, and you had David Bowie doing Young Americans. And it was a sort of meeting on the dance floor, if you like, the sort of double denim status quo freaks. Over here, you had the sort of Barry White, OJ, sort of Philadelphia people. And there was a genuine marriage. And the protagonists of that period sort of coalesced in that period. So that's when it started. And I thought,
also in 75, there's you mentioned Quentin Crisp's The Naked Civil Servant. I thought it was really interesting. There he is, his painted fingernails and his red hair. So that's clearly another pointer that paved the way, wasn't it?
That was something else that happened at the time. And also, that was also the year where a lot of people became aware of Kraftwerk for the first time.
Yeah, they were on Tomorrow's World, weren't they?
And if you look at a lot of the synth groups that grew up during this period, like blancmange and soft cell and orchestral maneuvers in the dark and ultravox, even the Pet Shop Boys. If you look at the sort of post-punk period, everyone took the Sex Pistols as their year zero. But for a lot of people who were involved in the synth pop world, Kraftwerk were their year zero. And Phil Oakey is quoted in the book as saying, it's all very well thinking, well, I had these 3 chords and I can do X with it, but I had one finger and a computer. And actually the music that I made with that one finger was as interesting, if not more interesting, than the music that they made with 3 chords and a guitar.
So where were you at this time? How does this fit in with your personal story?
Well, I came to London in the summer of 1977 and got involved in a lot of the punk scene, and then was in the halls of residence in 1978 called the Ralph West Halls of Residence, where a lot of the protagonists of this scene lived. And so I slowly became immersed in the scene, and I was sort of one step removed from it. But nonetheless, I found it completely fascinating because it was something that was completely at odds with the sort of post-punk narrative, which was, we are a punk group and now we're going to be something else. Because I think if you read the music press, and you know more about this than I do, but if you read the music press in the late 70s, ideology was far more important than aptitude. And the fact that you believed in something was far more pertinent than your ability to play your guitar.
Right. So can you remember when you first kind of came upon this new world that was emerging? You know, did you go to any of the clubs and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the Ralph West Hall of Residence, and there was a very good friend of mine who arrived at the Ralph West Hall of Residence in 1978 called Fiona Dealey, and she lived above me, or possibly below me, I can't remember, it was 40 years ago, and she would get dressed up to go to a club called Billy's. And I used to sort of laugh at her because I would have, I'd be wearing drainpipe jeans, a leather jacket and a Ramones t-shirt, and I'd be off to the Marquee or the 100 Club to watch the Members or the Buzzcocks or someone like that. And she'd be going to this nightclub, and then we'd sort of reconvene the next day and we'd sort of talk about things. And gradually I could feel that the narrative was moving, that there was something else happening over here that was kind of more interesting.
Right. And the dressing up was a hugely important part of it, wasn't it?
Well, it was. Initially, for me, I thought, why are these people looking like this, dressing like this? It's kind of crazy. But actually, it started to make sense because there was an orthodoxy about punk, which I was complicit completely. Leather jacket, jeans, t-shirt, spiky hair. I'm into this. This is great, brilliant, etc. And then you started to see other people being more inventive. And I think there was a resistance in the music press because I think journalists felt that there was a sort of an inclination or a sort of a move towards something that was out of this world. And I think one of the issues, and one of the most pertinent issues of this whole period, is that if you were to have interviewed a member of the Gang of Four or the pop group in 1978 or 1979, their aspirations would have been all about moving the culture. If any of them had said, we'd actually like our collective to be successful.
Yes, we want loads of money and have a hit single.
And one of the kind of really refreshing things about lots of people who were involved in this supposedly new world of the new romantic world is like, we'd love to be successful. We'd love to be pop stars. We'd love to be revered. We'd love to be on the cover of magazines and sleep with lots of girls or boys.
Yeah. And do you think there was a class dimension to this as well?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I write about in the book, and one of the things which people don't like to address is that it was about class. And actually, Gary Kemp from Spandau Ballet is very good on this, because Spandau Ballet were a band of largely Labour voting, working class guys who used to go to soul clubs. In fact, Gary Kemp even saw the Sex Pistols at the Screen on the Green. And they wanted to be successful. They were involved in this new world, but the largely, I think, left-leaning members of the music press at the NME couldn't kind of compute with it. You know, it didn't sort of fit with their generic idea of what a successful post-punk group adhered to. I mean, you guys know far more about this than I do, because you were at Smash Hits at the time and you saw the dichotomy between people who were, wanted to be Adamant or Duran Duran or Spandau Ballet, or people who had the furrowed brows who were at the NME thinking, what did I just say to Paul Morley, and did it sit with the idea of our sort of ideology?
Just dug one of these out the roof. Actually, it's an old Smash Hits with Visage on the cover. Amazing. Who I interviewed him, and I can barely remember it actually. But the interesting thing is that when we were making hay on Smash Hits, we were having a fantastic time with it. But the one of the big stories that you write about in the book also is the role of the style magazines. So you have ID in the face coming in because they've got the print quality and they've got the enthusiasm, as you say, for the ideology. That was a big part of it, wasn't it? Yeah, I think that. I mean, ID, The Face, and Blitz all launched within 3 months of each other in 1980. And even though they were all very different titles, I think they all had similar aspirations, because they were catering for perhaps people like myself who were 18, 19, 20 years old, who were not only interested in pop music, but were interested in cinema, in design, in politics. And I think there's a big misconception around this time, is that the idea of Thatcherism and entrepreneurialism became conflated, because everyone I knew at the time, no one had any money.
No.
And apart from a very few people, everyone was fairly sort of left-leaning. And yet we were all intent on sort of making our way in the world, whether we wanted to be journalists or fashion designers or video directors. We were all sort of creative. I mean, I think that one thing that did work against us is that we were all fantastically arrogant at the time. And I don't know where the arrogance came from, but we certainly had a belief in ourselves that what we were doing would eventually sort of become good, I suppose. I think we all felt that this was our version of the swinging 60s.
Do you think there was also something in the fact that it was before there was a kind of, before cool, the quality of cool, which is now something that's marketed by multinationals, in those days it wasn't, and so there was more room for people to make some kind of impact on their own. I mean, you're very familiar with the world of fashion, and you mentioned this quite a bit in the book. Was this when a lot of kind of small designers were coming through and were making their name, or was that a part of it?
Well, I think it was, but it was they were trying to move whatever they were doing forward in the same way that anyone was, whether they were a photographer or a fashion designer, video director, journalist, writer, painter, what have you. There seemed to be a sort of vacuum that we were filling. And I say we because I think everyone involved in the scene, regardless of whether they had any traction or even if they had any talent, felt that this was an opportunity. It really felt like it did in 1976, where you thought that the world was wide open, or at least Britain was wide open, London was wide open, or Sheffield, or Glasgow, or Coventry, Manchester. That he was an opportunity for us to do something. But I think more importantly than that is the fact that if you look at the Human League, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran, OMD, lots of these extraordinary people who came out of this vacuum did create some really, really brilliant pop music. I mean, you know, you guys were involved in the smash hits, and you look at the constituent parts of smash hits for 2 or 3 years, and they were full of these people.
And who are the people who you think have stood the test of time most successfully? Who are the people who've come out of it sounding better than we thought at the time, probably?
Well, I think it's this is a very interesting question, because I think that if you look back now, that a lot of the records that were produced in the UK in the late 70s and early 80s, they were made by America, because without MTV, a lot of these records would have disappeared. And I think that if you can think of the 70s as the decade of the album, I think you can look at the first half of the 80s as being the decade of the single. And I think that even though I know, David, that you're quite disparaging about a lot of the music that came out in this period, I think that you can think back to that period of the early 80s, 3 to 4 years in the early 80s, where the British pop single was at its zenith. And apart from that period in the mid 60s, I really think that is a fantastic period for great British pop music.
And the sales were absolutely incredible, weren't they? I mean, it's astonishing. You know, it could only have happened at a time of kind of booming economy, because the main launch vehicle was video, and video was ruinously expensive, you know. And it's astonishing now. There's a bit that you mentioned about Visage. The first check Visage get, and each member first check they get is for £350,000.
But now it's a lot of money.
I know. God. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it? But which bands, which do you think, Eurythmics, or I mean the Human League and ABC? I mean, they sound really good to me. The Human League still sound fantastic.
But also people like the Thompson Twins, who even then everyone knew the Thompson Twins were rubbish.
Yeah,
they were extraordinarily successful.
They were.
I think that I think a lot of people forget or have no interest in the fact that MTV was a sort of kicker for that. Because if you think of 1983 and that famous cover of Rolling Stone magazine, where for 3 months, 3/4 of the American charts were full of British pop singles.
Yeah, it was all Soft Cell, and wasn't it? Yeah, Duran Duran. Yeah.
Well, Soft Cell is still the longest lasting single in the American charts ever.
True. Yeah. Tainted Love.
Yeah, it was just for ages.
So on the Soft Cell front, another extraordinary detail in the book is that Mark Arm was talking about his PR at the time, who was Mariella Frostrup. Mariella Frostrup was trying to engineer dates with him, you know, with Mary Wilson, I think, and Susie, and trying to get him to be seen with a girlfriend, because, you know, at the time, because the record company had said to him, if Radio 1 think you're gay, they may not play your record. Doesn't that seem astonishing now?
But I think that's another interesting thing about the period, is that if you look back upon it now, the optics are centered around what the tabloids used to call gender bending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Men looking like women, women looking like men, which is an extrapolation of what David Bowie was doing sort of 5 or 6 years previously. But actually, I think far more importantly than that, it became a period that became a great platform for gay pop. And if you think of Soft Cell, if you think of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, you think of the Pet Shop Boys, you think of Bronski Beat, and this was a period where really popular, really successful, really public pop stars were allowed to have a gay image, and not just an image, but this was a platform for them as genuinely gay, successful entertainers, and that had never happened before. That's why I keep returning to this idea that that period was a period of great emancipation, and it was a period of great creativity, and it was a period of great bohemianism.
Yeah. It's very wide canvas, isn't it? You draw here. Is that fair to say? You know that I find it extraordinary that it's like a selection box. You can you let it fall open where it will, and you'll find just loads of names in there. You know, because your new romantic world, it obviously includes, you know, Wham and Sade and all these people as well. They're as important, aren't they?
Well, two things here. I think that the term new romantic in many people's eyes is still a pejorative, and that was a kind of a commercial restraint, I suppose, as to what to frame this period as. But the reason the book is quite bloated, and some of the criticism has been about the fact that it's quite big, is that I wanted to reference all of the different things that were happening during that period, like media, like video, like nightclubs, and all of the things which fed into that scene. Because I think taken in isolation, you can say, yes, a lot of this music is shrill and not particularly important or doesn't last, or is too dominated by the sort of visual aspect of presentation. But I wanted to include all of those aspects because I wanted to try and make a case for the fact that this was generally a very, very creative period.
Yeah. And it's extraordinary, the details that I was really pulled up short by reading Andrew Ridgeley talking about when he and George Michael went to see Genesis at Earl's Court. Yeah, it's that guy.
You can't forget that Martin Kemp is in a band that plays Steely Dan songs.
Yeah,
I remember interviewing Adam Ant once, and he said his big favourite was Rory Gallagher. You kind of forget
that's the stuff I love, you see, and that's what you see, Dylan. You know, if I can blow smoke up, at this point, Dylan, you're perfect for doing this because you love that kind of thing, don't you? You love the thing that doesn't sort of fit with the legend. Yeah. Well, is that fair to say?
That's why I think that this. I mean, I love the fact, you know, you can read so many stories about the punk period, and no one admits the fact that in 1974 they bought the Lamb Lies Down on the Broadway. Any of that doesn't fit. But so many people involved in this period admitted that so many things fed into that period. Yeah. And I just love that. And I sort of love the refreshing honesty of it, because a lot of it was bound up with, I've been sort of not coerced, but I've had this world opened up to me, and I'm going to pursue it. I'm going to enjoy it. And actually, a lot of people weren't listening to Iggy Pop in 1970.
No, absolutely. They definitely were. Absolutely. They definitely were. No, but also, you know, if somebody goes off and writes a book about, I don't know, Sade or Spandau Ballet, they are tempted to write, through the Sade or Spandau Ballet lens. You know what I mean? That they're kind of writing a bit of PR for them. Whereas you're not, you're saying all these people have extraordinary stories, and there's loads of stuff that doesn't fit with the myth. Like Mark and I were talking earlier about, I read the thing about Sade is talking about her early life, where they're on a council estate in a village.
In a village in the country.
In Kent, was it? I can't remember. Yeah. Essex, it might have been.
Yeah.
And she's, I think, Nigerian father. Is that? Yeah. And she said, so my one mother was a lone parent, but had two black children. And she said, we didn't have any trouble at all in the village. There was no racial animus that she was aware of at all, And I think it's one of the things that makes the book such a refreshing read. So you get all that kind of detail and color in there.
Well, I think I think one of the issues at the moment is that because there is so much focus on difference, that it's actually pushing people farther apart than bringing people together. But talking about that period, I think that if you look at the two main influences on the protagonist of that new romantic scene, they were David Bowie and Brian Ferry. And obviously David Bowie is the greater artist.
But actually, you make a real pitch for the importance of Brian Ferry, don't you? I mean,
Ferry was important because he painted for, for working class people or working class teenagers or lower middle class teenagers. He painted a picture of success, which is very attractive. And in some respects, very traditional, which is why he was very attractive and why lots of people, in some respects, tried to copy him, at least in the way they dressed. But the older those people became, and the more particular that Brian Ferry became, I think by the mid-'80s, they began to look at Brian Ferry as sort of anachronistic because he was pursuing a kind of sophistication that they sort of gone beyond in a way, that they had developed in a way that was perhaps less sophisticated, but perhaps more interesting because they realized that the future that Brian Ferry had painted was very particular and probably more based on class or the traditional class system, something that they were less interested in. However, I think that for me, lots of people involved in that world, if you looked at Stranded or For Your Pleasure or Country Life, they were visions of the future, visions of the world that we could never imagine because it was so exciting and so sophisticated and so full of wonder.
Is it also another way to look at this, that it was the kind of the victory of dance music, isn't it? That's the big difference between all this and punk rock is you could dance to it.
It comes out of all sorts of disco is such an important thing, isn't it? Donna Summer, Saturday Night Fever, all those things, Rocky Horror Show, all that kind of stuff contributes towards it too.
Well, I think you could look at that period in the early 80s and think that the constituent parts were they were the beneficiaries of Giorgio Moroder, of Kraftwerk. I mean, if you think that the Sex Pistols were sort of year zero for everyone that came after it, then Kraftwerk was certainly year zero for everyone who had a computer who came after it. But it's weird now to look at the world that we live in because we live in a world that's full of dance music. And actually, I think it's become incredibly generic and a bit stultifying and rather depressive that we live in a world that is driven by BPM, and it feels kind of depressing actually. And to be transgressive is all about image and less about music.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, this is going off at a tangent, but I think that there are lots of digressions from the new romantic period, which are negative. And I think we're living in them at the moment, but lots of things which are incredibly empowering and really positive, particularly in terms of sexuality.
Do you think it's also, it's very important, it came along before computers and social media and so forth. So if you wanted to do something, you went out and did it in the real world, didn't you? You went out and started a club, or you dressed up yourself, you did it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that what happened then is more important than what's happening now. But I certainly think that it was so contained and it was so small that if you were involved in a scene, it did give you a certain amount of power. Like I said earlier, it was, I think a lot of people, including myself, are incredibly arrogant about the scene because you felt that you were in the middle of something that was incredibly important. And it may not have been important, but because you felt like you were in isolation, that it did give you sort of an impetus. And maybe that's what people feel now when they're involved with social media and they can post something and they have the response of hundreds of thousands, millions of people. I don't know. Sorry,
it's a worldwide thing.
It was so revolutionary, you know, just small teams of people just teaching themselves how to make videos, how to produce, you know, just entrepreneurs. And compare the 80s compared to the 90s. The 90s seems to me quite reactionary actually compared to the 80s. The 80s was really forward facing and really thrilling.
I don't know. I think it's very dangerous in terms of, you know, being cultural historians, which we all are, looking at particular periods and saying that's better than that period. And I think that the 90s is a fascinating decade, and in some respects has an authenticity that the 80s didn't. But I do think that the 80s had an entrepreneurial spirit, which has previously not been acknowledged. And I suppose for me, this is a sort of passion play. It's something that I feel very passionate about and want to make a real case for this. This wasn't a period that was just about making crappy videos for MTV. It wasn't just about making shrill pop music. It was a period where people really felt that they had an opportunity to express themselves musically, sexually, sartorially, in what they did in terms of their writing.
Huge influence. There's a bit where Roy Hayes says that says no culture club, no Madonna, no Lady Gaga, no Marilyn Manson. I mean, would you agree with that? I thought it was really interesting.
It's really true. And even though that this period would not have been as successful without MTV, a lot of those big American stars of the 80s, who were obviously bigger and more important and had a greater profile than anyone in the UK, they wouldn't have happened without without the things that happened in the UK in the late 70s and early 80s.
Well, look, it's all there. All those voices, all those creators you were talking about, they're all represented in this. It's a thick tome, Dylan, and that's not a criticism at all, because they all deserve to be there, and all their voices deserve to be heard. And for me,
you're both in the book.
Yes, we're
now so many stories. I kept thinking,
at last we're heard.
Yeah. I kept thinking so many times, and even the story of Bananarama, you think it's amazing, these kind of
Bananarama,
slightly shambolic kind of amateur girls who are just so likable, you know, and almost overnight they go into international success. You think, well, that's a movie.
One of my favorite things is in the book is when we're talking about smash hits, when they're doing the story of the Human League and you're doing it in a comic strip.
Oh, yeah.
You have Phil Oakey with his, is it a Hank or a Shank?
It's Hank, isn't it?
A Hank of hair.
His mum and his dad. And the budgie in the cave.
His mother is Parrot. They all have the same hank of hair.
Five ducks on the wall.
It's so affectionate and so brilliant.
It's frankly, it's for Mark and myself. That's our proudest moment in media, isn't it? That we put the hank of hair on Phil Oakey's budgie. You know, put that on a
budgie, not a parrot. I'm sorry.
Oh, whatever. Dylan, it's been lovely to talk to you. The book is available now in all good bookshops and usual outlets.
And some bad bookshops as well. Yeah.
Okay. Lovely to talk to you.
Fantastic.
We'll see you soon.
Take care, guys.
Lovely to talk to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.